The morning sun hung low over the small town, casting a warm but quiet glow on the streets. But inside one of its most beloved local cafes, a storm was brewing, one that no one could have expected. It was supposed to be just another typical day, with the smell of fresh coffee drifting through the air and the sound of casual conversation filling the room. However, behind the counter of this quaint little cafe, a dangerous attitude was quietly stewing. What no one knew was that a simple moment was about to set off a chain of events that will expose the true nature of a place thought to be safe, familiar, and welcoming. Everything changed when an elderly black man, a retired military veteran, walked into the cafe. His presence was unassuming, just a man who had seen things, fought for his country, and now sought nothing more than a warm cup of coffee and some peace. He had seen war, battle, and the challenges that came with serving his country, but there was one battle he wasn't prepared for. He stepped up to the counter, hoping for a quiet morning, unaware that this place, one that had been a refuge for so many, was about to show its true colors. It wasn't just any cafe. This was a spot that many locals considered a second home. People came in for their morning rituals, getting their coffee, reading the paper, chatting with friends. For years, this cafe had been the hub of the community, a place where bonds were formed, laughter shared, and where the worries of the day seemed to vanish over a steaming cup of coffee. But today, something dark was about to unfold. As the black veteran stepped forward, the cafe owner, a man known to most for his friendly demeanor, greeted him with an unexpected coldness. Without warning, the atmosphere in the room shifted. People started to notice the subtle tension rising between the two men. The veteran, a man who had given his life in service to his country, was met not with respect, but with something far more sinister. The owner's words were sharp, and his actions even sharper. What had started as a casual interaction quickly spiraled into something far uglier, an act of outright discrimination. But what the cafe owner didn't know was that this was no ordinary customer. The veteran wasn't alone. A group of patrons, quietly observing the situation, began to realize that something wasn't quite right. Tension built in the room as whispers spread like wildfire. No one could believe their eyes. This wasn't supposed to happen in their beloved cafe. What followed was a sequence of events that no one could have predicted. The veteran, knowing his rights and understanding the weight of the situation, stood his ground. His calmness in the face of outright disrespect only added to the growing unease. Meanwhile, some of the regulars in the cafe began to speak up, challenging the owner's actions. But the owner, either blind to the gravity of the moment or arrogantly confident in his actions, doubled down on his decision. And that's when things began to get truly uncomfortable. What the cafe owner didn't realize was that the very people he had underestimated, the ones who had been quietly watching in the background, were about to take matters into their own hands. They weren't just passive observers. They knew that what was happening wasn't just wrong, it was dangerous. The situation, already tense, was now on the brink of something bigger. As the situation escalated, a new layer of tension emerged. Who were these regulars, these witnesses? What did they know, and why did they remain silent for so long? Was there more to this cafe than anyone realized? And why was the owner acting this way? Was it simply a reflection of his personal prejudices, or was there something darker lurking beneath the surface of his actions? The cafe, once a haven for the community, now became the scene of an intense standoff, where silence held a much deeper meaning than words ever could. The black veteran, standing tall in the face of adversity, refused to be dismissed. He knew his worth, his rights, and the price he had paid for freedom. But the owner, with his disdainful glances and cutting words, seemed to think he could push the veteran out without consequence. As the confrontation continued, the group of patrons who had gathered to watch began to change the narrative. One by one, they began to speak up, sharing their own stories of injustice, of being treated as less than human because of their race, their status, or their beliefs. It was clear that the actions of the cafe owner had stirred something deep within them, a fire that could no longer be ignored. The crowd, initially divided by awkward silence, now found themselves united in their belief that what they were witnessing was wrong. But just as the veteran was about to speak his mind, something unexpected happened. The cafe owner, realizing that his actions might have more consequences than he anticipated, suddenly shifted tactics. The next words he spoke would change everything. They would reveal whether he truly understood the weight of the situation, or if he was simply going to double down on his racist behavior. But as the veteran prepared to respond, a familiar face in the crowd suddenly stepped forward, catching everyone off guard. This wasn't just any person. This was someone who had the power to change the course of the confrontation completely. The room went silent, every eye turned, and the tension in the air thickened. In the next moment, the story would take a turn that no one could have foreseen. The real question now was, what would happen next? Would the veteran receive the justice he deserved? Would the cafe owner face the consequences of his actions? Or would this moment be swept under the rug, forgotten like so many others? All eyes were on this moment, and the next move could change everything. The room remained silent as all eyes were on the veteran and the cafe owner. The regulars in the cafe shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging uneasy glances. The tension in the air was thick, and the weight of the moment seemed to hang over everyone. The black veteran, who had lived through the trials of war, had seen horrors most could never imagine, and had endured countless injustices throughout his life, stood still. His eyes were calm, but his body betrayed a deep, quiet anger. He wasn't just standing there for himself. He was standing for all the people who had ever been looked down upon, dismissed, or told they didn't belong. This was bigger than a simple cafe confrontation. It was a moment that could either expose the ugliness of society or show the resilience of the human spirit. The cafe owner, on the other hand, was struggling to maintain control of the situation. His hands trembled slightly as he wiped them on his apron, trying to steady his breathing. It wasn't the first time he had acted like this. He had been known to express a certain discomfort with people who didn't fit the mold of the small town, predominantly white community. It wasn't just about race. It was about the power he thought he held in his cafe, a place that for years had been a pillar of comfort and routine for many. He had always been the one in charge, the one who set the tone, the one who could make people feel welcome, or not. But now, with the veteran standing there, unyielding and calm, everything was shifting. The owner could feel his usual sense of authority slipping away. There was something about this man, a quiet strength, a dignity, that made the owner feel small. He had always gotten away with his biases in the past, knowing that the majority of his customers would turn a blind eye or stay silent. But the situation was different now. The veteran wasn't just any man. He was a person who had seen the darkest sides of humanity and still chosen to stand tall. He wasn't backing down, and neither was the growing crowd of patrons witnessing the injustice unfold. It wasn't just the regulars who were beginning to shift their perceptions. People who had once been indifferent to the owner's casual racism now found themselves questioning everything. Among them was Sarah, a young woman who had been coming to the cafe for years. She was used to the usual small-town gossip, the quiet prejudices that lingered in corners, but she had never seen it this openly. She had grown up in this town, and despite the flaws she had seen, she always told herself it wasn't as bad as people made it out to be. She had even convinced herself that things had gotten better over the years. But now, watching the veteran, the realization hit her hard. She had been blind to the ugliness that existed in the very place she thought of as a sanctuary. Then there was Mark, an older man who had been sitting at his usual corner, nursing a cup of coffee in silence. He had seen it all, the changing faces of the town, the tensions bubbling beneath the surface, the whispers and sideways glances. Mark wasn't the type to speak out, to stir the pot, but something about seeing the veteran treated this way struck a chord deep within him. He had fought in a different war many years ago, and he had never forgotten what it was like to be respected and valued, no matter your skin color, no matter where you came from. He had seen brothers in arms of all backgrounds come together, and now, in this moment, he couldn't stay quiet. As the cafe owner began to mumble an apology, one that lacked sincerity, more a feeble attempt to regain control. Sarah stood up, her voice shaking with a mix of anger and disbelief. "You don't get to treat him like that," she said, her words cutting through the tension like a knife. "You don't get to treat anyone like that." The owner's face turned pale, a mix of shock and irritation flooding his features. He had expected this to blow over, a few uncomfortable moments, but not this. Not the wave of resistance that was slowly building around him. He hadn't realized just how many people had been silently watching, waiting for something to snap. And now it was happening, the balance tipping from his control to theirs. The veteran, still composed, looked around the room. His gaze met Mark's, and there was a quiet understanding between them. It was as if the veteran had seen the same thing Mark had seen in his own time, the unspoken unity that could be formed when people came together in the face of injustice. He didn't need to say a word. The message was clear. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been subjected to the sting of prejudice. But even as the cafe owner grew desperate, trying to smooth over the situation with empty words, a voice from the back of the room interrupted the growing tension. It was Paul, a man known for his silence and his deep connection to the local community. Paul had spent years behind the scenes, quietly making efforts to improve things, whether it was volunteering at the local shelters or speaking up when no one else would. But today, seeing the way the veteran had been treated, something in him snapped. "This is wrong," he said, his voice firm and unwavering. "We can't just stand by and pretend like it didn't happen. Not today." For the first time, the cafe owner seemed to falter. His earlier bravado was gone, replaced by a man suddenly aware of the growing rebellion around him. People who had once been content to ignore the subtle racism that lingered in the cafe now stood up, one after another, their voices adding to the chorus of condemnation. The veteran had done nothing more than ask for a coffee, yet in that simple act, he had unwittingly uncovered the ugliness that lay hidden beneath the surface of this small town. But even as the tension escalated and the cafe owner began to retreat, it became clear that the battle wasn't over. The real fight had only just begun, and the stakes were higher than anyone could have imagined. The veteran, once an invisible face in a sea of regulars, was now the symbol of something much larger, a fight for dignity, for respect, for a community that had long ignored the truth. But the question remained, what would it take for the owner to truly face the consequences of his actions? Would this moment of unity be enough to spark real change? Or would the town, once again, sweep the uncomfortable truths under the rug? The answer was hanging in the balance, and the next few moments would determine whether the cafe and the town would ever be the same again. The world was about to find out who was truly watching, and how much they were willing to do when injustice reared its ugly head. The room was now filled with voices, each one carrying the weight of years of frustration, pain, and silence. The cafe owner, once so sure of himself, was now backed into a corner. His face had turned red, his hands shaking as he tried to gather himself. The reality of the situation was setting in. He couldn't dismiss the crowd. He couldn't control this narrative. What he had hoped would be a simple confrontation was now a full-scale reckoning. And the veteran, standing in the middle of it all, was a symbol of something bigger, something that couldn't be ignored anymore. The crowd had shifted completely. No one was willing to stay silent. Mark, the older man who had been watching quietly, stepped forward. "This isn't just about a cup of coffee," he said, his voice steady but loud enough for everyone to hear. "It's about respect. It's about recognizing the worth of every person who walks through that door. You've made it clear you don't care about that, but we do." The cafe owner opened his mouth to respond, but the words didn't come. He looked around at the faces staring back at him, some filled with anger, some with disappointment, but all of them resolute. Then, as if sensing the shift in the room, he collapsed, both figuratively and literally, into his own self-righteousness. His gaze flickered between the veteran and the group of patrons, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't think. But it was too late. The moment of reckoning had come, and the veteran wasn't backing down. With a quiet but firm voice, he spoke again. "You don't get to not think. You don't get to make people feel like they don't belong, not in this country, not in this town, and not in this cafe." The tension in the room had reached its peak, and then, just as the owner seemed ready to lose his composure completely, there was a knock on the door. A figure stepped inside. At first, it was just another face, but it quickly became clear that this was no ordinary person. It was the town sheriff, a man who had been a regular at the cafe for years. He had seen everything: the long-standing divisions in the town, the quiet prejudices that went unnoticed, and the injustices that people had lived with in silence. But the sheriff had never spoken up before. He had always been just another face in the crowd, watching, letting things slide. But today, everything was different. The sheriff walked over to the counter and, without a word, placed a hand on the cafe owner's shoulder. The room went silent, all eyes on him. "I think we've all seen enough," he said, his voice cutting through the tension. "What happened here today is unacceptable. This man," he pointed to the veteran, "has done more for this country than most of us could ever dream of, and he deserves the respect of every person in this room, including you." The sheriff's words hit like a hammer, and the cafe owner, now visibly sweating, slumped in defeat. The veterans, the regulars, and the community at large had finally spoken with one unified voice. It wasn't about individual fights anymore. It was about changing the culture of this place, about standing up for what was right. The sheriff turned to the crowd, his eyes scanning the room. "If we want things to change, it starts here. We can't just sit back and let things like this happen. Not again." In that moment, something profound shifted in the cafe. The sense of unity that had been building among the patrons began to solidify. It was no longer a crowd of passive bystanders. They were now a collective force, determined to hold each other accountable and push for a better future. The veteran, still standing tall but with a softer expression now, finally spoke up. "I didn't come here today to fight. I just wanted to be treated like anyone else. But if my presence here today means something to all of you, then I'm glad I spoke up." He turned to the sheriff, nodding in appreciation. "And I'm grateful for your support." With that, the cafe owner, realizing the weight of what had just transpired, muttered an apology, though it felt hollow and incomplete. The sheriff, who had never once involved himself in such public disputes, stood by, his presence a reminder of how far-reaching this moment was. It wasn't just about one man's mistake. It was about the strength of a community coming together and making it clear that things could not continue the way they had. As the veteran walked out of the cafe, the patrons slowly returned to their seats, the atmosphere heavy with both relief and reflection. It was a strange mix of emotions, some still processing the events, others relieved that they had finally spoken out. But one thing was certain: this cafe, this town, had been changed forever. It had been a moment of reckoning, but more importantly, it had been a catalyst for real change. No one could walk away from what had happened and pretend things were the same. The confrontation had sparked something deeper, something that would continue to simmer beneath the surface until it eventually found its way to the surface in the form of collective action. People were more aware now, more willing to stand up when injustice appeared. And that was the most powerful takeaway from the entire experience. As the door closed behind the veteran, the weight of the past seemed to lift just a little bit. The cafe owner stood alone, his shoulders slumped in resignation, but the town was no longer his to control. The people had found their voice, and in that voice there was power, there was hope, and there was a sense that things were finally heading in the right direction. The shift had begun.